I didn't know what to do when I saw this bride crying on the road. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, lining the narrow, winding road somewhere between Montpellier and Albany. Ethan Collins gripped the steering wheel of his aging Jeep with one hand while his other lazily toggled between radio stations. It had been a disappointing weekend. A cancelled photo exhibition and a string of awkward conversations with gallery owners who only offered polite smiles. All he wanted now was to get home, kick off his shoes, and try to forget how disheartened he felt. The asphalt ahead was mostly empty, save for the occasional farm truck or wandering deer. That's why the white blur on the side of the road caught his attention so quickly. As he drove closer, he instinctively slowed down, squinting through the windshield. A woman in a wedding dress. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He eased the car onto the shoulder and stopped a few feet away, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The woman was sitting on the grass, her voluminous white gown bunched around her like a cloud. Her veil was askew, and the delicate fabric trailed beside her on the dirt. One hand rested limply on her lap, while the other seemed to wipe at her face. For a few seconds he remained frozen behind the wheel. Maybe she's waiting for someone, he thought. Maybe it's a photo shoot gone wrong. But no photographer in their right mind would leave a bride alone on the side of a country road. His curiosity and concern outweighed the instinct to drive on. He turned off the ignition and stepped out into the quiet. "Hey there," he called gently, trying not to startle her. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't look up at first. When she finally did, her eyes were red-rimmed, and her cheeks bore the faint streaks of dried tears. She looked at him as if surfacing from underwater, dazed, unsure whether he was real. I'm fine," she murmured. Her voice was barely audible. Ethan took a careful step forward, his boots crunching the gravel. "I'm Ethan. I'm not here to bother you. I just saw you and thought maybe you needed help." She looked down again, twisting the fabric of her dress between her fingers. After a long pause, she said, "Claire." "Nice to meet you." "Claire," Ethan replied, his voice soft but steady. "A friend? Family? Can I call someone for you?" She shook her head slowly. No, I don't want to talk to anyone right now." There was something in her tone. Not quite panic, not quite anger. That made Ethan pause. This wasn't a bride who got stood up or caught in a soap opera drama. This was something quieter, sadder. "Do you want to sit in the car for a bit?" he offered, glancing up at the sky. The breeze was starting to pick up, and dusk wasn't far off. "I've got water and granola bars. I swear I'm not a weirdo." That earned him the faintest trace of a smile. Claire hesitated, then slowly stood, brushing dirt from her dress. Her movements were graceful but tired, like someone running on the last dregs of energy. "Just a ride to the nearest town," she said. "There's a cafe about 15 minutes down. I think I just need to breathe for a while." "Deal," Ethan replied. He opened the passenger door and waited as she climbed in, carefully gathering the layers of her dress. As he started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the silence between them felt less awkward than it should have. Maybe it was the surreal nature of the moment, or maybe it was the quiet understanding that something significant, though undefined, had already taken place. Neither of them spoke as the trees zipped by. Claire stared out the window, her fingers occasionally brushing the edge of her veil. Ethan kept his eyes ahead, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Who was she? What had led her here? But something told him that answers would come, not by force but by patience. He adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of her expression. She looked less lost than before, not quite found, but not entirely adrift either. They drove on, the last light of the day fading behind them. The little roadside cafe came into view just as the last threads of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. It was a modest, squat building with string lights around the porch and a faded wooden sign that read Maple Creek Cafe. Ethan pulled into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching as he parked beside a rusted pickup truck. Claire had said nothing for most of the ride, her hands resting in her lap, her posture upright but tense. When the engine stopped, She exhaled as if releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Without speaking, Claire opened her door and stepped out, her wedding dress dragging slightly on the gravel. Ethan came around and held the door to the cafe open for her. The place was nearly empty, just a man in a trucker hat nursing a mug of coffee and an elderly woman reading a paperback by the window. A waitress behind the counter looked up and gave them a curious glance, but said nothing. They chose a corner booth away from the windows. Claire sat down with an air of practiced poise that contrasted sharply with the state of her dress. Her veil was folded neatly beside her now, and she had tied her hair back loosely with a ribbon she found in her purse. Ethan took the seat across from her and gave the laminated menu a half-hearted glance, more for something to do than from hunger. The waitress approached, took their orders with a polite smile, and disappeared into the kitchen. When they were alone again, Ethan looked at Claire and waited, giving her the space he sensed she needed. She stared down at the table, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wood grain. "I didn't plan to run," she said at last, her voice low and steady. "Was happening. I didn't even think about it until it." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure whether to offer words or just listen. "One moment I was standing in the back room of the chapel looking in the mirror, and the next I was grabbing my purse and walking out the side door." Her eyes didn't meet his. "No one saw me. I got into my car and just started driving." He watched her, trying to read the emotion behind her careful tone. She didn't sound panicked, more removed, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "I saw a road sign for Vermont and kept going until I couldn't anymore. I ran out of gas about 3 miles before you found me." "You didn't call anyone?" Ethan asked gently. She shook her head. "They'll figure it out eventually." Their drinks arrived, a mug of black coffee for Ethan and a cup of hot tea for Claire. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic as if drawing strength from its warmth. He noticed a faint tremble in her fingers, quickly masked by a sip. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said after a long silence. "With it. I knew I couldn't go through." Ethan leaned back, letting the quiet stretch between them again. He wasn't here to solve her problems, he reminded himself, but he could offer a space where she didn't need to pretend. That felt like enough for now. Claire finally looked up at him. "You must think I'm crazy." "I don't," he said. "You seem overwhelmed, but not crazy." That earned him a flicker of amusement, not quite a smile, but something softer than before. She looked around the cafe, as if noticing it for the first time. "This place reminds me of somewhere I used to go with my grandmother," she said. "Everything felt simpler. Back when Maple Creek Cafe," Ethan said, reading from the menu again. "Feel. Definitely has a time capsule." Claire took another sip of her tea, then leaned back against the booth. For the first time since they met, some of the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. "I don't think I've really felt anything for weeks," she murmured. "Just numbness. Not excitement, not dread." Ethan didn't reply right away. He watched the steam rise from his coffee and let the weight of her words settle. "I think," he said slowly, "sometimes we move so fast, trying to meet expectations, that we forget how we really feel. Maybe your brain caught up before your heart did." Claire tilted her head, considering that. "Maybe." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Outside, the night deepened. The trucker paid his bill and left. The woman with the paperback was now dozing in her seat. Claire glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's getting late." "Do you have somewhere to go?" Ethan asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. Obviously didn't work. "Not really. I thought I'd drive until I figured it out, but..." That Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Do you want me to take you somewhere? A hotel nearby?" Claire looked down at her hands, want to impose. "Honestly, I don't want to be alone right now, but I also don't..." "You're not imposing," Ethan said without hesitation. "Ride in that direction, I don't mind. I'm heading toward Albany. If you need a..." Claire looked up at him again. There was uncertainty in her eyes, but also a flicker of trust. "Cousin lives in Albany. I haven't seen her in a while, but it might be a good place to land." Then that's where we'll go," Ethan said, finishing his coffee. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Ethan. He offered a small smile, like a story worth finishing. It's not every day I find a bride by the side of the road. Kind of feels. For the first time that evening, Claire laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. And for a moment, the strangeness of the day faded, leaving only the sense that something unexpected and important was beginning to unfold. The highway unfurled like a ribbon of quiet possibility under the pale morning sky. A thin fog clung to the fields, softening the edges of barns and silos scattered across the Vermont countryside. Inside Ethan's Jeep, the mood was subdued, but no longer heavy. Claire sat with her feet tucked beneath her, gazing out the window, her wedding dress now covered by an old blanket Ethan had offered from the back seat. A paper cup of coffee warmed her hands, though she had barely touched it. They had decided to resume the journey early, the cafe's parking lot still damp from overnight dew when they pulled away. Claire hadn't spoken much at first, but as the miles passed and the silence grew more comfortable, she started to open up, offering bits and pieces of her story like scattered pages from a torn journal. It was all set up perfectly, she said quietly, eyes still on the passing scenery. The venue, the flowers, the dress, everything. The kind of wedding people put on Pinterest boards. Ethan glanced over, but it didn't feel like... Yours? Claire gave a slow nod. Not really. I went along with every decision. I told myself I was happy because everyone else was happy. My parents, my friends, his family. They all kept saying how perfect we were together. There was no anger in her voice, just weariness. His name's Ryan, she continued after a pause. We met at a charity event 2 years ago. He was charming, successful, said all the right things. Everyone loved him, and he loved being loved. Ethan didn't interrupt, sensing she was finally working through thoughts that had long gone unspoken. I ignored a lot of little things, how he always made the final decision, how he dismissed my ideas about the honeymoon, how he told me to quit my job to focus on the wedding, and then suggested I not go back after. She laughed softly, without mirth. I thought it was sweet at first, romantic even. I told myself he just wanted to take care of me. But you didn't want to be taken care of, Ethan said. Claire turned to look at him, her expression somewhere between surprised and grateful. Wanted to be a partner, not a project. No eye they passed a roadside stand selling maple syrup and apples. Claire leaned her head back against the seat, letting the movement of the car lull her. There wasn't a big moment, no fight, no dramatic realization. I just looked at myself in the mirror yesterday and thought, this isn't right. My reflection looked like someone I didn't recognize. Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel. The highway curved gently ahead, framed by trees that were just beginning to bud with spring leaves. What did you do then? He asked, his tone even. I walked out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No suitcase, no plan. Just my purse and my car keys. I drove for hours until I ran out of gas and sat on the shoulder wondering how my life had unraveled so quietly. She didn't cry. There was a steadiness in her now, as if saying it aloud had rearranged something within her. People will be confused, she said after a while. Someone just because I'm afraid of disappointing them. Hurt, maybe even angry, but I can't marry Ethan. Nodded, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror. Then to go through with something you know is wrong. It takes a lot more courage to walk away. Claire smiled faintly, eyes drifting back to the passing landscape. I kept waiting for a sign, something to tell me whether I was doing the right thing. But maybe not every decision comes with confirmation. Maybe sometimes you just have to jump and hope the net appears. They drove in silence for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The rhythm of the road, the gentle hum of the engine, the soft strains of a folk song playing on the radio, all combined into a sort of shared meditation. Eventually, Claire stirred and asked, "Do you ever feel like you missed your turn somewhere?" Ethan let out a slow breath, more than I care to admit. She looked at him, waiting. I've been chasing photography for years, trying to turn it into something more than a hobby. I had a shot at a real exhibit this weekend, but the gallery owner canceled last minute, said the space was going in a different direction. That's why I was on the road. heading back home with nothing to show for the effort. Claire considered that. "Do you regret it?" "Not the trying," he said. "Out what comes next. Just the outcome. But I think maybe I needed to fail a little to figure." She nodded slowly. "That sounds familiar." The miles passed under their wheels, the sun climbing higher into a sky that was clearing with promise. There was no grand revelation, no sudden fix. Just two people sharing a vehicle and a strange, quiet understanding that life sometimes needs to unravel before it can be rewoven. When they stopped at a rest area for gas and snacks, Claire wandered over to a vending machine, studying the contents like she was making a profound decision. She chose a bag of pretzels and a bottle of iced tea. Back in the car, she tore open the bag and offered it to Ethan. "For the road," she said. He took a handful and smiled. "Thanks, runaway bride." She laughed, this time freely. "Guess I'll have to live with that nickname." As they pulled back onto the road, heading south toward Albany, neither of them knew exactly where. They were going in the larger sense, but for the moment the open highway, the warmth of shared vulnerability, and the comfort of not being alone were enough. The road straightened out as they left behind the winding rural stretches and approached the edges of a larger town. Billboards began to appear, some faded by time, others advertising wedding venues, catering services, and honeymoon getaways. Claire noticed them all with a kind of bitter amusement, her gaze lingering on an image of a smiling couple surrounded by sparklers. Ethan glanced over and saw her expression tighten slightly before she turned away. They stopped at a diner on the outskirts of town, a red and white structure that had likely looked the same for the last 40 years. Inside it was nearly empty, just a few booths occupied by early travelers and a waitress who moved like she'd been doing this job since the beginning of time. They slid into a corner booth, and Claire ordered pancakes while Ethan settled on eggs and toast. The food wasn't remarkable, but it was warm and grounding. Claire stirred syrup into her coffee and stared out the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "I think people believe if you follow the formula, you'll be happy. You know, good school, decent job, someone to marry by a certain age. It's like there's this checklist for a proper life." Ethan nodded, his fork pausing over his plate. "Wrong. You think the problem must be you. And if you check all the boxes but still feel," Claire's eyes flicked toward him. "Exactly." She took a sip of her coffee and continued, more to herself than to him. "My parents had high hopes for me. Not in a demanding way, but more like they saw this clear path and assumed I'd follow it. I was the reliable one, the organized daughter, the one who always made sensible choices. So when I met Ryan and everything looked so perfect from the outside, it was like confirmation that I was doing it right." Ethan listened, sensing the layers of pressure she was unraveling. "They loved him, my friends loved him. He said all the right things, showed up on time, bought thoughtful gifts. But I started to feel like I was part of a performance, like I was acting out a role in someone else's story." She glanced out the window again. "I kept thinking it would pass, that maybe it was just wedding stress, that once we got through the ceremony I'd feel like myself again." Ethan didn't rush to respond. He let the silence sit between them until she seemed ready to go on. "But it didn't pass," as she said. "The closer we got to the date, the more I felt like I was disappearing. Every decision had been made for me or around me. The venue was chosen by his mother. The guest list was dominated by people from his side. I even ended up with a dress I didn't love because my maid of honor cried when I said I didn't like the one she picked out." Ethan winced. "Sounds exhausting." "It was," she said. "Waves. And I let it happen. I didn't fight it. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth making." Her voice grew quieter. "The last time I saw my mom before the wedding, she looked at me and said, 'You're so lucky, Claire. Not everyone gets a man like Ryan.' I know she meant well, but I remember thinking, shouldn't I feel lucky too? Shouldn't I be the one who's certain?" The waitress brought their plates and the conversation paused as they thanked her. Claire picked at her pancakes but didn't eat much. Ethan tried to offer her the space she needed, but it was clear the thoughts she'd kept buried for months were now pouring out in fragments, each one a small release. "I've never disappointed anyone before," she said after a while. "Not like this. And it terrifies me, I keep picturing their faces. My dad, my mum, even Ryan. The confusion, the shame, the anger. Ethan pushed his plate aside. That's not failure, that's honesty. You didn't disappoint them. You made a choice for yourself. She looked at him, searching his face for some sign of judgment, but found none. I know that in theory, but emotionally, it feels like I let them down, like I abandoned this story everyone had invested in. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. But it wasn't your story, not really. She nodded slowly. I think that's what hit me yesterday. Standing there in the chapel, everything beautiful and perfect. It all felt like someone else's life, like I'd stepped into a photograph I didn't belong in. They lingered in the booth long after their plates were cleared, the sun climbing higher outside the window. Claire seemed more grounded now, less adrift than she had been the day before. Her voice had steadied, and her eyes, though still shadowed, held a glimmer of clarity. You know, she said eventually, it's strange. I thought leaving would be the hardest part. But now I think the real challenge will be figuring out who I am without all of that. Without the wedding, the expectations, the perfect life plan. Ethan smiled. Sounds like the beginning of something real. Claire returned the smile, small but genuine. Maybe it is. They paid the bill and stepped back into the late morning light. The air was cool, the breeze soft, and the town around them just beginning to stir with weekend activity. As they walked back to the car, Claire seemed lighter somehow, still uncertain, but no longer paralyzed by it. She climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the blanket back over her lap. As Ethan started the engine, she looked over and said, "Thank you for not asking too many questions, for just letting me be." Ethan glanced at her and nodded. Sometimes the best thing we can offer is space. They merged back onto the road, the town receding behind them. Ahead lay more miles, more conversation, more quiet stretches filled with thought. But something had shifted. The weight of expectations hadn't disappeared, but Claire had taken the first steps toward setting it down. By early afternoon, the landscape outside the car window had transformed from rolling countryside to a string of small towns and suburban intersections. The road signs grew more frequent, and Claire began to recognize names she had seen on envelopes and invitations in her family's correspondence. Her wedding had been planned to draw guests from all over the state, and the memory of that planning, so meticulous, so exhausting, hovered like a specter she couldn't quite ignore. Ethan's Jeep hummed steadily along the highway, the radio playing low in the background. Claire had been quiet for several miles, staring ahead as if trying to see beyond the physical road, trying to glimpse what her life looked like now that the old route had been abandoned. She held her phone. In her lap, the screen dark. She hadn't turned it on since the night before. "I keep thinking about going back," she said suddenly, not looking at him, "just to get my things." Not to the wedding. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his attention still on the road but more alert now. "You want to do? Is that what?" Claire exhaled slowly. "I don't know. My stuff's at my parents' house. I stayed with them before the wedding to save money and be close to the venue. But going back now feels like walking into a courtroom without a defense." "You don't have to decide right this second," Ethan offered. "There's no rush." She gave a short nod, then added, "My cousin lives in Albany. We used to be close before life got busy. I thought about going to her place, but it feels strange just showing up without warning. Do you want to call her?" "I might," she said, hesitating. "But right now, I don't even know what I'd say." They passed a long line of trees, their branches still bare from winter, though buds hinted at spring. Claire leaned her forehead against the window and closed her eyes for a moment. "I don't really have anywhere else to go," she said. "This to anyone yet, not even to her. And I'm not sure I'm ready to explain all of." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He understood the type of confusion she was facing, the sense of being between identities, not quite who she had been, not yet who she was becoming. After a while he asked, "Little while? Would you feel better if you had somewhere neutral to land? Just for a..." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I know a place in Albany," he said. "Small guest house, nothing fancy. I stayed there once during an assignment. It's quiet, run by this older couple who treat everyone like family. If you need somewhere to think, not commit to anything, just rest, it might be a good spot. Claire studied him, searching his face for signs of obligation or discomfort. She found none, only calm sincerity. "I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't worried about where you'd end up," he added. "Me to drop you off at a bus station or hotel instead, just say the word." "But if you want, no," she said quickly. "I don't want to be alone, not yet." The admission surprised them both. She cleared her throat. "Pretending I'm fine isn't helping. I'm not proud of how lost I feel, but Ethan nodded. There's strength in admitting you need time." They stopped for gas just outside a town with a name neither of them could pronounce. Claire got out and stretched, pulling her cardigan tighter against the breeze. As Ethan filled the tank, she walked to a nearby patch of grass and stood for a while, eyes closed, head tilted toward the sky. When she returned, she said, "If you don't mind the detour, I'd like to go to that guest house." Ethan smiled. Not a detour, just a different route. Back on the road, Claire seemed more settled in her decision. She even turned her phone on briefly, skimming through the flood of messages and missed calls. Her mother had called twice, left one voicemail. Ryan had sent a single message. "Where are you? Please call me." She stared at the words for a long moment before locking the screen again. "No response?" Ethan asked gently. "Not yet," she replied. "I'm not ready for those conversations." They reached the outskirts of Albany as the sun began its slow descent. Traffic thickened and the urban noise returned, honking. Horns, distant sirens, the hum of life continuing regardless of personal crises. Claire watched it all from the passenger seat, her eyes wide but no longer overwhelmed. "This feels like another planet compared to yesterday," she said. Ethan laughed. "That's life for you, always switching scenes without warning." The guest house was nestled on a quiet residential street, lined with maples and modest brick homes. A small wooden sign out front read, "The Willows, Guest Lodging." Claire sat up straighter as they pulled in, a mixture of nerves and relief, flickering across her features. "Looks peaceful," she said. "It is," Ethan confirmed. "Step when you're ready." "You can stay here a few nights, no pressure. Just figure out your next." They got out and walked to the porch. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a warm smile. "Ethan Collins," she said, clearly recognizing him. "And who's this lovely young lady?" "This is Claire," Ethan replied. "She's looking for a quiet place to breathe for a bit." The woman, Helen, as she introduced herself, ushered them in without hesitation. The interior smelled of lavender and lemon. Photographs lined the walls, and a gentle piano tune played from a nearby speaker. After a quick check-in, Helen showed Claire to a small room on the second floor. It was simple. A bed with a quilted cover, a reading chair by the window, and a small writing desk. Claire stood in the doorway, taking it all in. "This will do," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I'll head out after you're settled." Claire turned to him, grateful. "You've done more for me than I can." "Explain." "I don't know why, but you needed help, that's reason enough." She stepped forward and hugged him briefly, a gesture filled with gratitude but no expectations. Then she turned and walked into the room, closing the door gently behind her. Outside, as Ethan walked back to his car, the evening light stretched, long across the pavement. He looked back once just to be sure she was safe. She was. And for the first time since they met, she looked like someone beginning to imagine the possibility of peace. The next morning began with rain, soft and steady, tapping against the windows of the Willows. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a borrowed robe, her wedding dress now hanging by the window like a relic from another life. The events of the previous days played faintly in her mind, not as sharp memories, but as impressions. The cool air on the side of the road, the feel of gravel under her heels, the smell of diner coffee, the hum of Ethan's car engine. There was no rush, no itinerary. For the first time in what felt like years, she woke up without an expectation to fulfill. She moved slowly, grateful for the silence. Downstairs, Helen had left out a small breakfast spread, toast, preserves, tea. Claire took a plate and sat by the window, watching the light shift through the curtain of rain. Midway through her second cup of tea, her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Ethan. Still in town for a bit. Want to get some air later? Could use the company. She considered it for a moment before typing back a simple reply. Yes, they met an hour later outside the guest house. Ethan was in jeans and a worn jacket, hands stuffed in his pockets. The rain had eased to a mist and the streets glistened. He greeted her with a nod and a quiet smile. Feeling more human today? He asked. A little, Claire said. I didn't expect to sleep as well as I did. I always thought that place had good energy. Helen has a gift for calm. They walked through the quiet streets of Albany, the early hour keeping most of the city indoors. Claire spoke of the books she had noticed on the shelves in her room, how the furniture didn't match but felt intentional, how even the scent of the place made her feel anchored. Ethan shared stories from his last visit, a photography assignment on small-town community centers, one of which had been just a few blocks away. Eventually, they ended up at a small park nestled between residential buildings. The trees stood like sentinels above a series of worn benches and walking paths. Claire paused near a stone bridge that crossed a narrow stream. I keep thinking, this is temporary, as she said. Come collect me and tell me to go back. Like I'm on pause and any minute someone will... But there's no one coming, Ethan replied. And there's no going back, not really. She nodded. I know, I think I'm still adjusting to that. They sat on a bench near the stream, the quiet rush of water beneath them. Claire pulled her coat tighter and rested her hands in her lap. You said you've been chasing photography for a while, she said. What keeps you going? Ethan thought for a moment. The moments that feel like truth, not the paid gigs or the gallery shows, those come and go. But when I capture something honest, something unfiltered, that's what reminds me why I started. Claire looked at him, curious. What was your first photo that felt like that? He smiled at the memory. A woman sitting alone on a bus stop bench. She had this look, not sad, not happy, just waiting. The light hit her face in a way that made it look like a painting. I didn't even think. I just took the shot. It wasn't perfect, technically, but it was real. She considered this, then said, I've never had anything like that. No calling. I just did what was expected, what felt responsible. There wasn't room for much else. Maybe now's your chance to figure out what your version of that moment is. They stayed in the park for a long while, the city slowly, waking around them. Eventually, the mist turned to sun, breaking through the grey with a cautious brightness. Claire tilted her head back, letting it warm her face. Feels like a new day, she said softly. Later, they returned to the guest house. Claire hesitated on the porch steps. Do you need to be somewhere, she asked. Ethan shook his head. No real schedule at the moment. I was thinking of heading out this afternoon, but my plans are flexible. Claire's eyes flickered, with an idea. Would it be crazy if I asked to tag along for a little while? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You want to travel? Not far, she said quickly, but I don't want to stall out here either. Just a drive a little further. I'm not ready to plant myself anywhere. He considered her request, then nodded. I've got no objection. Where do you want to go? She smiled. No idea. Let's just follow the road for a bit. An hour later, they were back in the Jeep, Claire now dressed in jeans and a borrowed sweater. Her wedding dress remained behind, tucked neatly in the closet at the Willows. As they pulled away from the curb, she looked back only once, then faced forward with a calm resolve. They drove aimlessly, guided only by instinct and a shared understanding that neither of them wanted to be alone. They passed through small towns, pausing occasionally to stretch their legs or get coffee. With each mile, the pressure of the previous days seemed to dissolve. They spoke easily, not about the past, but about lighter things. Childhood memories, movies they never finished, road trip disasters. At one point, Ethan pulled off the road near a quiet lake. The sky was a canvas of shifting clouds, and the water reflected them in still silence. They walked to the edge, skipping stones and watching the ripples. Claire crouched near the shoreline and said, I feel like I'm collecting pieces of myself in these moments. Like every mile is returning something I didn't know I'd lost. Ethan didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, letting the wind carry away the need for answers. That night, they found a small town with a single inn and a diner that stayed open late. Claire insisted on buying dinner. They sat in a booth by the window, sharing pie and coffee, laughing at stories from the road. As they walked back to the inn, Claire said, "Feels like the right kind of lost. I don't know where I'm going next, but this, Ethan smiled and opened the door for her. Then let's keep getting lost a little longer." They woke up to the sound of wind nudging against the inn's windows, the early morning light stretching thin across the floorboards. The inn was old but well kept, a relic from a quieter time, with creaky stairs and quilts that smelled faintly of lavender. Claire dressed slowly, her body still adjusting to the rhythm of unfamiliar beds and long stretches of driving. Ethan waited downstairs with coffee and a guidebook he'd found near the reception desk, flipping idly through pages detailing scenic routes and forgotten trails. When she joined him in the dining area, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, and her face still bare of makeup, Ethan smiled. "There's a route through the Catskills that's supposed to have great views this time of year." Claire took the coffee he offered and glanced at the open book, used to not having a destination. "Views sound good. I'm getting." They checked out and headed west, the road winding through forested hills and sleepy towns with names that barely registered before they were passed. For a few hours, the rhythm of the road lulled them into a peaceful quiet. They passed a truck hauling firewood, then an old school bus repurposed as a mobile bakery. At a roadside market, they stopped to buy apples and sat under a tree to eat them, watching the locals come and go with baskets of produce and arms full of flowers. It wasn't until late afternoon, with the sun already dipping behind the trees, that the tire blew. There was a loud thump followed by the unmistakable thudding drag of rubber against asphalt. Ethan pulled to the shoulder, the car settling with a sigh as if it too had grown weary from the travel. "Well," he said, stepping out to assess the damage, "that's not ideal." Claire joined him, peering at the flat tire. "You have a spare?" "Yeah, somewhere under 1,000,000 other things in the back." They unpacked the trunk, spreading camera bags, jackets, snacks and blankets across the roadside like a disorganized picnic. Claire found the jack and tools while Ethan located the spare. Together they worked in rhythm, Ethan loosening bolts, Claire holding the flashlight as the day slipped into evening. They laughed at their fumbling coordination, and despite the delay, the moment carried a strange kind of intimacy, the kind born not from romance, but from shared inconvenience and unspoken respect. By the time they had the tire changed, it was dark and they were miles from the nearest town. A quick check on Ethan's phone revealed a small village a few miles off the main road. It wasn't much, but it had a bed and breakfast and a diner that served food until 10. They drove slowly, careful with the spare tire. The village, Briar Hollow, seemed suspended in time. Wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs, lanterns strung between trees, and a quiet stillness that felt both eerie and comforting. The bed and breakfast was a 2-story house with ivy climbing the porch and a bell over the front door that jingled softly as they entered. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Roger, showed them to their rooms without question. Claire's was upstairs, with a sloped ceiling and a view of the town square. Ethan's was down the hall, simple and quiet. They dropped off their bags and reconvened in the hallway, exchanging tired smiles. "Dinner?" he asked. "Definitely," she said. The diner was nearly empty, save for a pair of elderly men playing chess near the window and a teenager behind. The counter scrolling through her phone. Claire and Ethan slid into a booth near the back and ordered grilled cheese sandwiches and soup. The food arrived quickly, steaming and satisfying in a way only diner meals can be. As they ate, Claire looked around the room, eyes settling on the details. The worn counter, the dusty jukebox, the framed newspaper clippings on the wall. "There's something about places like this," she said. "Like time moves slower here." Ethan nodded. "Maybe that's why people stay. It feels safe." She stirred her soup. "For the first time in a while, I'm not thinking about tomorrow, not panicking about what comes next." "That's a good thing," he said. Tomorrow always shows up whether we plan for it or not. After dinner, they walked through the town square. Strings of lights glowed overhead, and a fountain in the center trickled softly into its basin. They sat on a bench and listened to the sounds of night, crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional creak of a porch swing. Claire leaned back, her hands tucked in her coat pockets. Do you ever wonder how many versions of yourself exist out there? One that stayed, one that left earlier, one that never left at all. Ethan considered that, all the time. I think about the version of me that took the safe job, stayed in my hometown, maybe got married young. And then I think about this version, still figuring it out, still drifting a little. She turned to look at him. I like this version. He's honest. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Not longing, not desire, just a quiet recognition of the rare bond formed in uncertain spaces. They returned to the bed and breakfast in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Claire paused at her door, hand on the knob. Thanks for today, she said, for not letting a flat tire ruin everything. Ethan smiled. Sometimes, a flat tire's just a detour worth taking. She nodded and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment before turning toward his own room, the sound of the town settling around him like a lullaby. Outside, Briar Hollow slept, and somewhere in the stillness, a moment of peace bloomed quietly in the hearts of two people who had stopped trying to outrun themselves. The morning light in Briar Hollow was golden and filtered through lace curtains, casting quiet patterns on the wooden floorboards of Claire's room. She lay still for a few minutes after waking, listening to the sounds outside her window, the soft chirping of birds, the creak of a bicycle passing down the street, the low murmur of a distant radio. It felt like waking up in a world untouched by urgency, as though time itself had paused to let her breathe. She rose slowly, wrapping herself in the wool cardigan she had borrowed from the Willows, and padded downstairs where the scent of brewed coffee and warm scones met her. Ethan was already seated at the long wooden table in the dining area, flipping through a local paper, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up as she entered and offered a quiet, familiar smile. "Sleep okay?" he asked, handing her a mug. "Better than I have in weeks," she said, taking the cup with both hands and letting the warmth settle into her. "This place feels like it exists outside of everything." "That's exactly what it is," Ethan replied, a pocket between decisions. They ate breakfast with few words. Conversation wasn't needed. There was something about shared silence that had become comfortable between them, the kind that required no explanations, no small talk. When they finished, Claire wandered out to the porch, wrapping herself in a shawl as she settled into the swing that creaked gently under her weight. It was there, mid-morning, with the sunlight warming her feet and a breeze rustling the ivy, that her phone rang. The sound was jarring after so much quiet. Claire stared at the screen. It was her mother. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the answer button, the pressure in her chest tightening with a mix of dread and guilt. Then she took a breath, tapped the screen, and brought the phone to her ear. "Mom," she said softly. There was a pause, then the sound of a breath, and quick, relieved. "Claire," her mother said, "thank God, are you okay?" "I'm safe," Claire replied. "I'm fine, just away." "Where are you? We've all been so worried. Ryan's been calling. Your father's barely slept." Claire closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I know, I needed time." Her mother's voice, though laced with concern, wasn't sharp. It was gentler than Claire had. "You left in your wedding dress, sweetheart. No note, no call. We didn't know what happened. I couldn't go through with it," Claire said, her voice steadier now, and everything in me screamed that it wasn't right. I stood there in that room. Her mother was silent for a long moment. "We always thought you were happy," she said finally. "You never said anything." "I didn't know how," Claire replied. "It felt like the moment I questioned it, everything would collapse, and maybe I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fairy tale." Another pause, softer this time. "I'm sorry," her mother said. "I should have asked more. I should have noticed. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. You were caught up in it too. Everyone was. What will you do now? Her mother asked. I don't know yet, Claire said honestly. I'm figuring it out. Are you alone? No, she replied. I met someone, a friend. He helped me when I didn't know what to do. I see, her mother said, a note of curiosity she didn't press further. Claire, take the time you need. Just let us know you're okay from time to time. Your father worries even if he doesn't say it. I will, Claire said. Thank you. After she hung up, she sat for a long time on the porch swing, watching. The street, her thoughts unraveling like thread. There was no explosion, no dramatic plea from her mother, no scolding. Just concern and a kind of quiet understanding she hadn't expected. It left her feeling more seen than she had in months. Ethan joined her eventually, 2 mugs in hand. He passed her one without a word and sat beside her, the swing shifting slightly with their combined weight. That was your mom? He asked after a moment. Claire nodded. Yeah, she was better than I expected. Good, Ethan said simply. They rocked together in silence, the swing creaking rhythmically, the street alive with small town charm. A woman walked past with a basket of flowers. A child chased a paper airplane down the sidewalk. Everything moved forward, indifferent to past mistakes and broken plans. Claire sipped her coffee. It feels strange. Like I expected this conversation to break me. But instead, it made me feel like I might finally be stepping into my own life. That's what happens when you stop trying to live someone else's, Ethan said. She looked at him, studying the lines around his eyes, the calm in his posture. Had to walk away from something like that? Have you ever? He thought for a moment. I left someone once, a long time ago, not at the altar, but close. We had a life planned, apartment, friends, holiday routines, but it wasn't real. It was a picture we both kept painting, and neither of us wanted to admit the colors didn't match. Was it hard? Very, but necessary. They sat until the sun shifted, casting long shadows across the porch. Claire stood and stretched. I think I'd like to write, she said. Suddenly, need to start untangling them. Not a book or anything, just thoughts, feelings. Ethan smiled. There's a notebook in the glove compartment. I keep it for moments like this. They returned to the Jeep and Claire retrieved the notebook. Its pages were thick and cream-colored, the kind that invited truth. She sat under a tree near the edge of town while Ethan explored with his camera, and for the first time she wrote without censoring herself, about fear, relief, regret, hope, about Ethan, about the strange comfort of empty roads and unfamiliar towns. When she looked, up the sky had begun to turn a pale pink. Ethan approached, holding a photo he had just taken, a cracked window with ivy growing through it, the light casting soft patterns on the floor inside. This town, he said, it's full of little ghosts. Claire smiled. So am I. But yours are starting to quiet down. She looked back at her notebook, at the open page where she'd written, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm not afraid of going there anymore. And for the first time since she stepped out of that chapel, she believed it. They left Briar Hollow just after noon, the town fading behind them like the final frame of a quiet film. The road ahead was dry and clear, the sun warming the windshield in a gentle cascade of gold. Claire sat with the notebook on her lap, flipping through the pages she'd filled the day before. Her handwriting, usually tight and structured, had taken on a looser, more fluid quality, as if her inner voice had finally found space to breathe. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the open window. There was no destination spoken, no fixed plan. It was a rhythm they had both come to appreciate, one foot in the present, the other testing the future with quiet curiosity. As they passed a small sign for Albany, Claire closed the notebook and said, somewhere around here. My cousin lives. Ethan glanced at her. You still want to see her? I think I should, she said. She's been one of the few people in my life who never expected me to fit a mold. We lost touch a bit, but if anyone would understand, It's her. They stopped for gas, and Claire tried calling. The line rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She left a message explaining she was nearby and would like to visit if possible. Her voice shook slightly at the end, but she steadied it with a deep breath. When she returned to the car, Ethan was sipping from a bottle of water. "No answer?" he asked. "She might be away," Claire replied. "Her job takes her out of town sometimes. I'll wait a bit." They resumed their drive, circling through quiet neighborhoods, tree-lined streets and modest homes that whispered of calm lives and routines. Claire watched it all through the window, wondering what her life might have looked like if she had taken other turns. Not just about Ryan, but about everything. College choices, job offers declined, chances never taken. 2 hours passed with no return call. Claire checked her phone again, then tucked it into her bag. "I don't want to just show up uninvited," she said, "supposed to stand on my own a bit longer. And honestly, maybe this is a sign that I'm." Ethan slowed the car near a bookstore cafe they had passed earlier. "I know a place you could stay for a while," he said. "Quiet, private, not far from here. It's a small inn with a few rooms above the shop. I used to come here when I needed to clear my head." Claire looked at the building as they parked. It had a deep blue awning, ivy crawling up one side, and large windows that revealed shelves of books, a coffee counter, and a woman knitting behind the register. A chalkboard outside listed upcoming author talks and poetry nights. Inside, the scent of roasted beans and old paper filled the air. Claire wandered among the shelves as Ethan spoke briefly with the manager. By the time he returned, she was reading the back cover of a novel, completely absorbed. "There's a room available," Ethan said softly. "Just a place to be for now. Top floor, corner view, no long-term commitment." Claire set the book down and nodded. "That sounds perfect." They carried her small bag upstairs together. The room was small but airy, with wooden floors, a writing desk near the window, and a bookshelf filled with forgotten classics and local authors. A soft armchair faced a reading lamp, and a stack of folded linens rested on the bed. Claire placed her notebook on the desk and turned slowly in the center of the room. A pause I chose. "It feels like." Ethan leaned against the doorway. "That's the best kind." She turned to him. "I think I need to stay here a few days, maybe longer." "I figured you might," he said. "There's no rush." Claire crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I'd go, thank you. You've carried me farther than I ever thought." He shrugged lightly. "All I did was drive." "No," she said, her voice clear. "You listened. You waited. You didn't try to fix me. That's rare." He smiled and took a slow breath. "Opening in Syracuse, I said I might check out. I should probably head out tomorrow. There's a gallery." Claire nodded. "It's time, I think, for both of us." They walked downstairs together and spent the rest of the day exploring the neighborhood. Claire bought a new pen and a small box of tea. Ethan browsed vintage records and took a few photographs, storefronts, shadows across sidewalks, Claire's profile against the light of a window display. As evening approached, they sat outside the cafe, sharing a plate of pastries and talking about places they still wanted to see. Claire spoke of coastal towns she'd read about, of art museums and hidden gardens, of the fantasy of waking up in a place where no one knew her name. Ethan spoke of open skies, deserts lit by stars, cities where language was unfamiliar and beauty was found in the unexpected. When the sky turned violet and the shop lights flickered on, Claire stood. "Tomorrow then," she said. "Tomorrow," Ethan replied. They hugged long and steady without promises or definitions, just two people who had intersected at the exact moment they needed each other most. Later, Claire sat by the window, of her room, pen in hand, writing a letter she might never send. It began with "Dear future me," and unfolded with the quiet urgency of someone finally ready to meet herself. Below, the bookstore's lights dimmed. Across town, Ethan checked into a small motel and uploaded the day's photos. In the silence of their separate rooms, a new plan was forming, one not dictated by fear or expectation, but by the slow, steady rhythm of rediscovery. The first morning Claire spent entirely on her own began with the faint sound of a bell over the bookstore door below. It chimed softly each time someone entered, a background rhythm that became as familiar as birdsong. She sat in the little room's armchair with her legs tucked beneath her, a cup of tea warming her hands, and the journal resting open on her lap. The words came slower now, not because she lacked things to say, but because she was beginning to understand them better before they reached the page. Downstairs, the shop buzzed with quiet energy, the murmur of readers, the low hiss of steamed milk from the cafe counter, the rustle of pages turned with care. Claire ventured down mid-morning, greeted by the scent of cinnamon and the gentle nod of the woman behind the counter. They exchanged few words. It was the kind of place where presence alone was enough. She ordered a coffee and found a table by the window, placing her notebook beside the cup. Outside, people moved with quiet purpose, their coats drawn close in, the early spring breeze. She didn't know them and they didn't know her, which gave her a strange kind of freedom. There were no expectations, no polite conversations laced with subtext, no eyes watching to see if she faltered or succeeded. The day unfolded in a slow cascade of moments. Claire wandered between bookshelves, touching spines, reading back covers, pulling down titles that stirred some old curiosity in her. She read for hours, losing herself in stories that were not hers, letting the unfamiliar voices soften her own inner monologue. When she grew tired of reading, she wrote fragments, thoughts, lists of what she missed and what she didn't. By late afternoon, the journal held a page titled "Things That Make Me Feel Like Me," and the list beneath it was uneven but honest. Old music, handwritten letters, train, rides, museums on quiet weekdays, the sound of trees when the wind moves through them slowly. She wrote photography and paused, thinking of Ethan and the way he framed the world. She added honest conversations and freedom to say no. That evening she walked alone through the streets. The air was cool and crisp, scented, with chimney smoke and budding trees. She didn't have a route, just followed the curve of the sidewalks, turning wherever instinct pulled her. A florist's window stopped her. Daffodils and tulips in neat rows, tiny buds wrapped in brown paper. She went inside and bought a single yellow tulip, cradling it like a promise as she returned to the bookstore. In her room, she placed it in a glass of water beside the bed, a small reminder that beauty could be simple, that she didn't need an event or occasion to celebrate something alive. The next few days passed in a gentle rhythm. Claire began waking earlier, using the quiet hours to write before the shop below filled with voices. She took long walks with no destination, discovering hidden murals and tiny cafes with names like The Quiet Cup and Chapter and Chai. People began to recognize her face, offer nods of familiarity. She became a regular without trying. One afternoon, the bookstore's owner invited her to help restock a few shelves. Claire accepted, grateful for something to do with her hands. They worked in companionable silence, organizing titles, dusting surfaces. She didn't explain why. She was there or what had led her to that room above the shop, and no one asked. That too was a gift. Her cousin never returned her call, and eventually Claire stopped checking for a response, not out of bitterness, but from an understanding that some doors didn't need to reopen. Instead, she wrote a letter she never intended to send, just to say what needed to be said. She tucked it into her journal and moved on. In the evenings, she sometimes reread parts of what she had written since leaving the chapel. The first entries were fragmented, panicked, full of guilt and confusion, but as the days progressed, the tone changed, steadier, clearer. She saw herself more as a whole person and less as someone broken or fleeing. A week after she arrived, she received a small package at the front desk. No return address. Inside was a folded envelope with her name, a postcard of a lake, and a note in Ethan's handwriting. "Keep going. You're doing better than you think." Tucked behind it was a photo, black and white, slightly grainy, of Claire standing outside the cafe in Briar Hollow, her face turned upward toward the sky, light falling across her features. She stared at it for a long time, touched by its quiet elegance. It didn't feel invasive or overly sentimental. It felt like being seen and being understood without needing to explain. She framed the photo using an old picture frame she found in a thrift shop and placed it beside the tulip, which had begun to open fully. The two sat like bookends on her small desk, reminders of moments when she had felt whole. By the end of the week, Claire found herself at ease in a way she hadn't known for years. She spoke with strangers without performing. She wrote for herself, not for clarity or confession, but because it brought her peace. She went entire mornings, without checking her phone. She no longer imagined returning to her old life, not because she had erased it, but because it no longer called to her. In the quiet, she rediscovered her own voice. Not the one shaped by politeness or expectation, but the one that whispered in solitude and sang in stillness. She had not reached the end of a journey, nor the beginning of another. She had simply paused, and in the pause, she had found herself. Claire awoke before sunrise, the first traces of dawn bleeding softly through the curtains. The light painted long gold-tinged shadows on the wooden floor of her small room, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread when opening her eyes. The room, once unfamiliar, had become a cocoon, not just a place to rest, but a space to rediscover who she had been beneath the layers of obligations and carefully rehearsed smiles. She stretched, rolled her shoulders, and rose with unhurried grace. There was no ceremony to the morning anymore. She brewed tea, pulled on a soft sweater, and opened her journal without pressure. The words flowed easily now, not searching for answers, but simply existing. She wrote about the smell of the bookstore, about the rhythm of rain against the windows the night before, about the dream she had where she walked barefoot through a field of tall grass and didn't once feel the need to apologize for her direction. By mid-morning, she headed downstairs and into the bookstore, now a familiar refuge. The owner, Marlene, was rearranging the poetry shelf when she looked up and smiled. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in some extra hours," she said. "For a while, and you've got a natural touch with customers. Eliza's going to be out." Claire blinked. It was the first offer she had received in weeks that didn't come with expectations. Just an open hand, held out with quiet trust. "I'd love to," she replied. And so, a new rhythm began. Claire worked a few hours each day, helping restock shelves, chatting with patrons, learning the register. She wasn't trying to prove anything or impress anyone. It was enough to contribute, to feel needed in a space that had no history of her past. In return, she was given room and board, a small guest room in the back of the shop just off the kitchen, with a narrow bed and a tall window that caught the evening light. She moved her few belongings with care, arranging the framed photo Ethan had sent and the dried tulip, now brittle but still beautiful, on the windowsill. These small tokens grounded her, reminders that beginnings did not always require a loud announcement. The bookstore became her world. Mornings were for cleaning and arranging, afternoons for customers and conversation, evenings for quiet reading and tea by the front window. She got to know the locals, a retired teacher who adored biographies, a teenager who devoured science fiction, a man who came every Friday to buy a mystery novel for his wife. She began keeping a small notebook behind the counter, jotting down overheard phrases and favorite customer stories. It wasn't meant for anything, not a book or a blog, just a private collection of the ordinary, beautiful details of people passing through. One day, while shelving a delivery of new titles, she paused with a paperback in hand and stared at the cover. It was the same book she'd been given years ago, back when she still thought being agreeable was the same as being kind. She opened to the first page and reread the inscription written by a friend she no longer spoke to the woman who always makes the right choice. She smiled faintly and slid the book onto the shelf, no longer burdened by the weight of the old praise. Spring advanced, subtly but surely. Buds on the trees outside the shop grew plumper, and daffodils began to poke through the sidewalk cracks. Claire started walking more in the evenings, sometimes venturing to the river at the edge of town, where the water reflected the sunset like melted copper. She carried her notebook on these walks, often stopping to scribble down a thought or an image. Her body changed too, not visibly to others but in how it felt to her, lighter, more aligned. The constant knot in her chest, the one she used to wake up with, carry through meetings and tuck into her wedding dress, had slowly loosened, replaced by something calmer. She spoke with her parents once a week. The conversations were no longer awkward or full of hidden disappointment. They had begun asking real questions, not about when she'd return or what she planned to do next, but how she was feeling, what she had discovered about herself. Her father sent a book he thought she might like. Her mother mailed her a scarf she had knit during the winter. One afternoon, Marlene handed her a letter that had arrived at the shop. It was from Ethan. The envelope contained a short note and another photo, this one of a narrow street lined with market stalls, vibrant fabrics catching in the wind, a little girl in a yellow dress dancing in the corner of the frame. I passed through a village in northern Pennsylvania and thought of you when I saw the colors. Hope you're still finding stories worth telling. Claire smiled at the message and tacked the photo beside her desk. She didn't write back. Not yet. It wasn't time. Instead, she continued building her days. She started attending a small writing group that met every Thursday evening in the back of a bakery. She didn't share at first, just listened. But eventually, she read a passage about walking away from a life you were never meant to live. The room was quiet after she finished, the silence filled with something better than applause and understanding. She wasn't waiting for a new story to begin. She was already in one, writing it with every choice she made to stay, to speak, to feel. Her goals were no longer shaped by expectations or the need for validation. They were small, personal, meaningful. Learn to cook something new. Finish the book someone recommended. Walk farther each week. Trust herself to keep showing up. She still didn't know exactly what came next. There was no mapped-out career path, no romantic plotline waiting to unfold. But there was peace in the unknowing now. Possibility, rather, than fear. Each morning, when she opened the shop and flipped the sign from closed to open, she felt it, a quiet joy in the simple act of beginning again. Not because someone told her to, not because she needed to meet a deadline, but because it was hers, entirely hers. The town had settled into the heart of spring by the time Claire saw Ethan again. It happened on a Saturday, the kind that drew people into the streets with baskets, cameras, and light jackets tied at the waist. The bookstore was busier than usual, its windows flung open to let in the breeze and the scents of flowering trees. Claire was behind the counter, arranging a display of new releases when the familiar chime of the door pulled her attention toward the entrance. He stood there with the same relaxed posture, hands in his pockets, a small travel bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was slightly longer, sun-touched. There was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe it was simply more visible now. For a second, neither of them moved. The room continued around them, customers browsing, a child asking her mother about a picture book, but time thinned for them both. Then Claire stepped out from behind the counter and he met her halfway. "You're here," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I passed through Albany and figured I'd drop by. I wasn't sure if you'd still be in town." "I never meant to stay this long," she admitted, "but here I am." They stood facing each other, and when Claire smiled, it wasn't a smile of reunion or unresolved emotion. It was recognition, simple and whole. They didn't rush into conversation. Instead, she guided him to the small cafe corner of the shop, where they took seats near the window, 2 cups of coffee between them, the light casting long shadows over the wooden table. He told her about the places he had seen since they last. She spoke, towns with murals, a woman who carved birds from driftwood, a festival where lanterns lit up an entire hillside. His stories were quiet and vivid, threaded with observations rather than conclusions. Claire listened closely as she always had, her hands wrapped around her cup, her eyes steady. When he finished, she shared her own updates. The job at the bookstore, the writing group, the walks by the river, the notes she had started collecting for a personal essay she might one day publish. She spoke without hesitation, her words sure, no longer weighted by the fear of judgment. Ethan listened with a small, almost imperceptible pride, not because her life had become extraordinary, but because it had become hers. At one point, he reached into his bag and pulled out another photograph, a candid shot of a bookstore in a different town, with a street musician playing outside and people dancing. He slid it across the table. "For your wall," he said. Claire turned it over in her hand. "Lens. You've got a whole gallery of strangers dancing through your—" "They're not strangers," Ethan said. "Not once they're caught in the moment." They spent the afternoon wandering. The town had changed subtly in the weeks since Ethan had last seen it. Claire pointed out new shops, a mural that had been painted by a group of local students, a bench where she liked to sit and write in the evenings. They stopped by the river, where willow trees dipped their branches into the water and children played along the banks. It wasn't the same as the first days they had spent together, marked by uncertainty and transition. Now, the air between Willem was calm, seasoned by time. Claire no longer looked lost. Ethan no longer looked like someone running toward or away from anything. They had both, in their own ways, paused long enough to catch their breath. At dinner, they chose a quiet table in the back of a small restaurant that had recently opened. Candles flickered gently in glass jars, and the menu was scribbled in chalk on a wall-sized board. They talked about small joys, new recipes, books that surprised them, the pleasure of solitude when it was chosen instead of imposed. Ethan spoke of returning to Vermont soon, of an upcoming gallery event in Boston. He didn't frame it as a goodbye, nor did Claire ask if it was. They both understood that what they had shared didn't require permanence to matter. After dinner, they returned to the bookstore. Claire unlocked the door and stepped inside to retrieve something. When she returned, she held out a small envelope. "For you," she said. Inside was a letter, one she had written weeks ago and never sent. It was about the day they met, the moments after, and how something as simple as a ride from a stranger had begun the quiet undoing of a life that no longer fit. She had rewritten it several times, but kept the original intact. She wanted him, to see what it had felt like from her side. Ethan read it in silence. When he looked up, his expression was not emotional but steady, anchored in something deeper than sentiment. "Thank you," he said. They stood on the sidewalk outside the bookstore, the evening cooling around them, the streetlight humming softly overhead. Claire folded her arms, not out of defense, but to feel the comfort of the night. "I don't know where I'll go next," she said, "but I'm not afraid to wonder anymore." "That's all anyone can ask for," Ethan replied. "To wonder without fear." They embraced once more, a slower embrace than the last, one marked not by uncertainty or unresolved need, but by mutual respect and quiet affection. When they pulled apart, there was no need for a promise. Claire watched him walk away, his figure blending into the night, not as someone leaving, but as someone continuing. She returned to her room and pinned the new photograph beside the others. Then she sat at her desk, turned on the lamp and opened her notebook. Outside, the night moved softly through the trees. Inside, Claire began to write again, not to remember or to forget, but simply to keep going, one page at a time. Claire sat on the windowsill of her small room above the bookstore, the early morning light warming her bare feet as it crept over the wooden floorboards. Below, the first delivery truck rumbled into place, its brakes sighing as it stopped to unload crates of new titles. The scent of baking bread drifted up from the bakery across the street, mingling with the faint notes of a piano tune playing, somewhere in the building. Another day had begun, unassuming and full of its own quiet rhythm. She held a letter in her hands, not addressed to anyone else but to herself. The envelope was plain, the handwriting deliberate. She had written the words over the course of the past few days, distilling reflections into sentences that felt both intimate and free of pretense. She didn't write it to anchor a conclusion or define a turning point. She wrote it as a marker, a gentle acknowledgement of how far she had come since the moment she first stepped out of the car on that roadside, dressed in a wedding gown and trembling with doubt. She placed the letter in her notebook and set both on the desk. Her hands were steady. There was no ache of regret, no lingering sense of what if. The questions that used to haunt her had quieted, replaced by a sense of possibility that felt rooted in her own voice. The choices she now made were hers alone, and that was enough. Downstairs, the store opened with the sound of the front bell. Claire dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and descended the stairs with the comfort of familiarity. She moved through the aisles with ease, greeting customers by name, answering questions, recommending books with a soft conviction she no longer questioned. This life, modest as it seemed, had become a sanctuary, not in its silence, but in its truth. By midday, a soft rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows and blurring the edges of the view outside. Claire paused at the front desk to watch the drops race each other down the glass. A woman browsing near the travel section asked if the store had any journals, and Claire led her to the writing nook near the back, suggesting a leather-bound notebook with thick pages and a spine that promised to hold secrets without judgment. Later, during a quiet hour, Claire stepped into the break room and brewed a cup of tea. She leaned against the counter and allowed her mind to wander. She thought of her parents, who had visited once since her move. They had stayed in a nearby inn and brought old photos from her childhood, sharing quiet stories and asking about her writing. There had been no speeches, no demands, just a slow rebuilding of trust between people who had loved each other imperfectly. Claire had learned to let the silences between them be tender rather than strained. She thought of Ryan only rarely now, and when she did, it was without bitterness. They had exchanged one letter each, brief and respectful, acknowledging what they had shared and what they could not become. There were no dramatic ends, no apologies rewritten in desperate tones, just closure, quiet and necessary. That evening, Claire visited the riverbank, where the water moved steadily under a canopy of leaves now full with spring. She sat on the same bench where she had once written about feeling lost, the journal still tucked in her bag, though she no longer clung to it for answers. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground, and a couple walked past holding hands and whispering to each other with gentle smiles. She thought of Ethan, of the way he had appeared in her life without demand, without expectation. They hadn't spoken since he passed through town weeks ago, but she carried the memory of him easily, not as a fixed point, but as a moment of grace. Their connection had been a turning point, not a destination, a chapter that didn't need an ending to matter. Back at the bookstore, Claire closed up the shop and lit the lamp in her room. She opened her notebook, flipped past the older entries, and began a new page. Her handwriting was confident, her lines clear. She wrote not of what had been, but of what might be. She wrote of ideas, of stories she wanted to tell, not about brides running from weddings or women finding themselves in strange towns, but about ordinary people choosing courage in small moments. She wrote of books she wanted to read, places she wanted to visit, not to escape but to expand. She wrote of staying longer in the town, of perhaps taking on more at the shop, of submitting her first personal essay to a local literary journal. When she set the pen down, the rain had stopped. The street below glistened in the lamplight, and the bookstore's sign swayed gently in the breeze. Claire opened the window and let the fresh air in, standing quietly with her hands on the frame. In the distance, someone played a soft tune on an acoustic guitar. The melody was simple, a few repeating chords, but it carried across the street, with a kind of intention that made her pause. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her, not because it reminded her of anything, but because it didn't. It was new, entirely new. She returned to her desk, sealed the letter to herself, and placed it in the drawer beneath her notebooks. Not to forget, but to remember where she had started. She turned off the light, crawled into bed, and listened to the night settle into stillness. There were no promises to fulfill, no grand resolutions, just the quiet certainty that the path ahead, whatever shape it took, would be hers alone. And that at last was enough.